All right, we have work to do. Thank you very much.
It's good to finally meet you.
You're Burns, right? As Christina said, I'm Dan Okrent, and I'm very happy to be here at the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker series. Ken is the distinguished speaker. I'm the semi-distinguished stooge who's here to ask him questions. And I agreed to do it because I've known Ken for, I don't know, 22, 23 years, and I never get to see him because he's so damn busy and so damn productive. So I had to fly from New York to Ann Arbor to have a conversation with him, and you're all welcome to join us for it. But before we do, as Christina mentioned, we both have Ann Arbor roots, and this is the Ann Arbor that Ken grew up in and that I pretended to go to college in. The face here on the far left, and many of us, is Bill Ayers, who got famous during the presidential campaign a few years ago. This was in his Weatherman stage. Diana Oughton, whom I knew both of them very well. Diana was killed in the 12th Street bombing in 1970, the tragedy of that period, but a wonderful person. These are just a series of the kind of thing that went on a regular basis in Ann Arbor. Then in the top picture, this was the world's most pointless sit-in. It was at the county building. It had to do with something I don't quite remember, and I'm actually in it. I'm the geeky guy with the glasses. I think Ken was involved in this one, right?
That's right.
Here we've got, let's see, Tom Hayden and a variety of other adventures from the period. As you see, a lot of people in uniform. That was big. Ken, you had some experience with the South University.
I worked at Discount Records at the corner of South U and Forest for 4 or 5 years. No one recognizes me. I had hair down to here. But during this minor conflagration, my head met a policeman's billy club. There was some very over-anxious Wayne and Macomb County sheriff deputies and riot police that were growing idle since the Detroit riots and wanted to bust some heads.
Something to do.
They did.
I didn't get to meet Ken when he was selling at Discount Records because I always stole my records. This is an amazing event that took place in 1968. This is called 69, Dionysus 69. This photograph was taken for the Daily by my dear friend Andy Sachs, who still lives in Greater Ann Arbor. And when performers came and performed in the nude in the Michigan Union, a very well-known group from New York, and everybody was arrested, and more cops turned out for that than anything else I ever saw. Dick Gregory, he was big in your life, right?
This is the...
Oh, I'm sorry, this is the Blues Festival. The next slide is Dick Gregory. The Blues Festival was just coming into its own back in the late 60s and early 70s. Here's Dick Gregory.
So he appeared at Hill Auditorium. Maybe some of you remember this, and I remember being so inspired that I chased him down as he was leaving the stage door, and it's the only time I've asked somebody for an autograph and got it from Dick Gregory. I still have this little scrap of paper on which he wrote.
I voted for him for president in 1968.
That's funny because my father voted for Eldridge Cleaver.
Yeah, well, you know, we were divided. This is an early film festival. These are some posters from the Great Ann Arbor Film Festival going back into the 60s. This is another one from the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Gives you a kind of an idea of what the festival was like in those days. That was not somebody who was a patron. And then this is Ken Burns' Ann Arbor, I think, right? A lot of places. Yeah, a lot of warmth.
It looks like only Middle Earth has survived.
Yeah, why would that be? The art fair, and then one of my favorite pictures, Ken Burns. Now
in front.
I'm kind of tempted to leave it up there for the next hour, but I won't do that to him.
This is in my short hair period. Well, not quite the shortest.
No, we're about to get to the short hair period.
No, but this was only half the length that it became.
Of course.
So the picture I think you're going to show is the last time I had my hair cut in 7th grade.
This is the last time he had his hair. Yeah, you haven't had it cut in the 7th grade.
But it looks like I'm in the 3rd grade, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, he was a really geeky 7th grader. But as you see from this, the hairdo has its history. It's a Burns trademark. And that's the slideshow. Ken Ann Arbor, its influence on you, your arrival here, talk about it.
I can't imagine, and I felt it and breathed it in today as I came very early from the airport and sort of explored all the haunts, is incredibly seminal in everything that I am. I think I had all of my molecules rearranged here at Hampshire, in Ann Arbor before I left to go to New Hampshire and Massachusetts. But this is where I decided to become a filmmaker at age 12. This is where I went to school. It's funny, I just assumed that I would just go to the University of Michigan. I was a faculty brat, but because I didn't go to the University of Michigan, I'm also a townie by virtue. So I think I crossed the bridge, the gaps, or if there are any.
You're bisocial.
I'm bisocial. Between town and gown. We always felt before the trimester came in that we really owned the town in the summertime. That's when we really finally felt like when we got rid of all the students, it was great.
So when's your first motion picture camera? When does this happen?
My father gave it to me when I was in high school at Pioneer, and I started making sort of cheesy, pretending to aspire to the Ann Arbor Film Festival dramas and documentaries and things like that with little super.
And have you destroyed them all to protect the innocent?
They have somehow disappeared. I don't know where they are. One of these days, somebody will show up with them.
But when does it strike you that filmmaking would be your career?
It's sort of born in tragedy. My mother, the reason why we moved to Ann Arbor in 1963, my father had taught for almost 8 years at the University of Delaware as an anthropologist. He was the only anthropologist in the state of Delaware, and he was coming here to one institution in a state with lots of celebrated institutions. Of course, this is the best. And he would be one of 40 anthropologists in a department. But he chose this over another offer because the other town didn't have a hospital. And my mother had been very, very sick with cancer, and we had moved here sort of desperate to come and avail ourselves of the extraordinary talents of the people at the University Hospital. And we did for a long time and postponed her life. But she died in the spring of 1965. And it was after that my father and my brother and I were alone. My father had a fairly strict curfew for us, but he forgave it with me if there was a movie on TV, a late night movie that would last until 1 a.m. with all the, Popeil ads. He would take me to the architecture, it was then called Architecture Building, and we'd go to the Cinema Guild.
Yeah.
And we would go to the Ann Arbor Film Festival together. We'd go to the campus theater, which was the first theater built after the Second World War, and it's so sad that it's not there, but it would often play first run, new wave things, and I just was inculcated, but it was at these watchings with my dad that I saw him cry for the first time. And he hadn't cried amidst the many sort of escalating tragedies of the thing. And for a 12-year-old, I understood completely. I remember this moment. We were watching Odd Man Out by Sir Carol Reed at the Architecture Auditorium. And my dad cried. James Mason, Claire Bloom, Irish Troubles. And I understood instantly the power of film had provided him with a kind of safe space that could express things that perhaps everyday life hadn't permitted him the opportunity to do. And I vowed right then and then I would be a filmmaker. Now, I wanted to be Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Howard Hawks, who I particularly like, or Buster Keaton. Or Luis Buñuel, who is, I think, probably still my favorite director, or Akira Kurosawa, all the people that I was inculcated during this period with. And I kept elaborate notes. I have over 5,000 little cards that I wrote notes on all the films that I saw in junior high and high school, and found them recently. But I became a filmmaker. It was very interesting because I had a personal crisis when I was in my early 40s, almost 20 years ago. And I said that I seemed to be keeping my mother alive. And he said, well, what do you think you do for a living? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you wake the dead. You make Abraham Lincoln and Jackie Robinson and Louis Armstrong come alive. Who do you think you're really trying to wake up? And I suddenly recalled all of those early steps to making movies.
So how does it become history? In obviously at a psychological, deep level, that's the connection to your mother's death. but you're making conscious choices. You go to college at Hampshire College in
Hampshire.
Massachusetts. Or, well, my daughter went there, and we call it Hampshire College, but that's okay.
But can I say we're undefeated in football since 1970 when we opened. We have never lost a football game.
That's absolutely true.
We don't have a football team, but we've never lost a football game.
In fact, that football team is not playing in Michigan Stadium right now. I know that you had some, there were faculty members there, particularly Jerry Liebling, the great photographer Jerry Liebling, who had great influence. But when are you seriously making documentary films? When does this begin?
Well, it sort of started here. My father was a still photographer as an avocation in addition to being a cultural anthropologist. And I spent the first year of my life in the highest village in the Alps that's occupied year-round, with a little quaint village that was then had one foot in the Middle Ages and the other in the 20th century. And so I had the recollections. My father built a darkroom, and my earliest memory is of him building it and then watching that alchemy take place. So I was sort of ripe to be taken over by the faculty at Hampshire College, who were all social documentary still photographers, who were much more interested in the kind of fare we show at the Ann Arbor Film Festival than they were a Hollywood product. And so kind of disabused me, of that sense. They kind of looked at me and said, they call it the industry. Doesn't that give you a hint? And then I just felt that love of photographs, the idea that a single photograph had in it a past and a future from that arrested, that decisive moment Cartier-Bresson is supposed to have said, and hated the label thereafter. But I wondered whether it was possible to not just hold still photographs in filmmaking at arm's length, which is what everybody did until you could get to motion picture, but whether you could move in and sort of energetically explore the landscape and anticipate what that past might have been and what its future might have been, and to add complex sound effects. And all of a sudden, I found myself, the last thing I did at Hampshire was a project on history, and and then I picked, I thought completely accidentally, a history project as my first film. And if you told me then, 35 years later, you're going to still be making history, I would have just thought you're crazy. But what I had found was not only the form, film, that I wanted to express it, but I found the thing, the way a painter says, I work in oils, not watercolors. I do still lifes, not landscapes. And that was American history. And the last time I took an American history course, not at college, was, at Pioneer High in 11th grade, when they hold a gun to most people's head and say, you will take American history.
So give us the origin of Brooklyn Bridge. And I say the origin of Brooklyn Bridge, of making your first big film, financing it, getting a film made. I mean, it's one thing to have done what you've done since then, and presumably people say, I think I'll do a decent film, but you were nobody, you were a kid. So how did you do it?
So it was born, my best friend then and now is a guy named David Blistein. He was a book salesman in New England, and one day I had had a case of pneumonia, and he came into my apartment and into my bedroom and threw down a paperback copy that Avon Books had just published of David McCullough's Great Bridge, the epic story of the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. And I sort of read it in one gulp, and I said to my partners in our new company called Florentine Films, and we were barely staying alive, just offering ourselves as cameramen on a daily rate to like the BBC and Italian
What was
television.
the daily rate?
It was $150 for a cameraman, $125 for the sound man, and $115 for the assistant, Buddy Squires, who is now
Still
the
working
greatest
with you.
and still working 40 years later. And we were just we would get a couple days' work just to pay the rent. And I said, we'll do that. They thought I was crazy. And I looked 12. I mean, that was 7th grade, not 3rd grade. And so if you can just jump a little bit farther to now 22, 23, trying to sell the Brooklyn Bridge. But I've always felt, people would say, this child is trying to sell me the Brooklyn Bridge. No, and slam the door. And I kept for many years 2 gigantic binders, those big 3-ring binders on my desk with literally hundreds of rejections as a kind of humbling experience.
Are you working out in the meantime? Are you putting stuff together? Are you doing research?
We get a little bit of money and we'd shoot some stuff, and then once I'd achieved critical mass on shooting, and we wanted to film the bridge in every time of day and light, we wanted to shoot the archives in that energetic spirit that I was talking about, and this is probably $50,000, $60,000 worth of stuff, nothing. And then I had made no money, And I was living in New York, and I realized that I was at this sort of critical point where I would put the film on top of my refrigerator and wake up 30 years later like that ad guy who was always going to write the novel but didn't because there was a paycheck. And so I moved to a place where a lot of my friends lived in southern Vermont and, in my case, southeastern New Hampshire, and moved into the house I'm living in now and just realized I could live for nothing there for a couple of years and figured out through more grants and whatever how to edit this film. And it got nominated for an Academy Award, and people said, so you're moving back to New York or you're going to LA? And I realized I then made the best decision, professional decision I ever made, which is I said I would stay there.
And it's worth mentioning, I've been a consultant on 3 films with Ken. I was on camera in a couple of them. Before Ken completes a film, he brings people up to Walpole to have them look at it in whatever, I don't know, that's more than rough cut, it's further than that. And it's extraordinary. You arrive in this small town in New Hampshire, and there's this industry. It's like, it's Ken Burnsville. He's employing everybody, the people he's brought in, the film professionals he's brought in, but also the people who live in this town, a number of whom have gone on to become filmmakers themselves.
Yeah, we've taken interns from Dartmouth or Keene State College and, often, shoo them out the door and they've gone on to great things. Or we keep them. And, one little kid that came in after high school is now in his 40s and, 3 kids and a mortgage and one of my best editors, and housewives that are producing. And, it's not brain surgery, but it does take a lot of hard work, and you sort of gather the people together. And what I miss, and I've talked to you about this before, is that I miss, not desperately, but I miss sincerely the society of my colleagues that you would get in New York, the dinner parties, the connections, seeing other people's work in that way. But I also am able to get a lot more done. Even though I'm on the road constantly trying to raise money, constantly filming and working on stuff, nonetheless, when we get back there, it's really focused stuff. It's a beautiful, exquisite New England town, but what we do there is we work really hard making films.
So after Brooklyn Bridge, speaking of raising money, presumably if you're nominated for an Academy Award, it gets a little bit easier, and you're no longer selling the Brooklyn Bridge, you're selling Huey Long and Statue
The Shakers and Statue of Liberty.
Films, but then comes the big moment of the Civil War. For those of you who were not watching television because you hadn't been born yet when the Civil War arrived, I can tell you it was really one of the greatest, most emphatic moments in television history. The nation stopped for a week to watch something on public television. It was really, thrilling. This was different work. This was not 90 minutes or 120 minutes. Tell us about the genesis.
Well, that was the scary thing. I actually had realized that the Civil War had been the determining factor of all those early films. The bridge wouldn't have been built without this new metal called steel, which the war helped to promote. The guy who built it, Washington Roebling, got his practical training as a bridge builder during the Civil War. The Shakers declined precipitously after the Civil War, not just because of the social and economic changes in the country, but the psychic changes.
Well, the Shakers also didn't have sex.
Well, no, but they had been the most successful of all those commutarian experiments, but the question of the soul's survival wasn't as big a deal post the murder of, now we think, 750,000 other Americans. Huey Long came from a dirt-poor North Louisiana parish that refused to secede from the Union. They saw correctly that the Confederacy was a rich man's cause and became a hotbed of the kind of populism that would spawn Huey Long. The Statue of Liberty was originally intended as a gift from the French to Mrs. Lincoln to commemorate the survival of the Union despite her husband's ultimate sacrifice. So everywhere I turned, the next film on the Congress, its greatest test was when there were 2 Congresses. So everywhere I turned, you began to see its centrality. And I finished here in Michigan with my dad one Christmas day. I finished a novel called The Killer Angels about the Battle of Gettysburg. And Michael Scher won the Pulitzer Prize in the 70s. And it was a just riveting book. And I hadn't even been to Gettysburg, and I remember closing it that afternoon, and my dad walked in. I said, I know what I'm doing for my next project. And he said, what? I said, the Civil War. He goes, what part? And I said, all of it. And he sort of shook his head and walked out like my idiot son.
Okay, well, let me stop with the idiot son right now. Ken, I've heard you in the past say, I think with justification, that you think of yourself as a historian. and a filmmaker.
First a filmmaker, because at the heart is trying to tell a story, and what I found was that I loved Waking the Dead.
But were you intimidated by the prospect of producing something that was supposed to be historically accurate about the most recorded moment in American history, about more have been written about than anything else? And you're walking into the face of everybody from Bruce Catton to the great Shelby Foote to the not so great Carl Sandburg. What was it?
Well, you know, I think the same person who'd sold the Brooklyn Bridge had continued the kind of naivete that you could sort of bite off more than you could chew and learn to chew it. We hadn't been longer than an hour or an hour and a half, and suddenly we were talking about something. Originally, it was going to be 5 1-hours each year of the war, and I remember going to an executive at public television and say, I think it's going to be longer. And he said, what, 7, 8? I said, I think it's going to be like almost 12 hours. And he just gulped really hard and came and looked at some stuff and said, I agree. And a lot of it is we went to all of those people. We went to the Marxist historians who were certain that it wasn't, you know, any Civil War didn't have anything to do with the battles. We went to the conservative historians of the lost cause. We collected everybody. And I guess to have them in our tent pissing out than the other way around, though, as you know, a lot of piss did come in.
Piss inside the tent, too. Yeah, that's right.
But the idea was to sort of be corrigible and soak up as much as we could, but to sort of apply what had been inculcated in all of these other things, or was inculcating in me as I was experimenting, practicing. And it's all been practice. All of the 40 years now has been practice. And the Civil War just hit that moment. And I said about the Brooklyn Bridge film that it was emotional archaeology that I was interested in, not excavating dry dates and facts and events of the past, the sort of shards of some archaeological dig, but somehow some larger emotional truth, not sentimentality and nostalgia. Let's distinguish from that, but not retreating into a rational world in which 1 and 1 always equals 2, but some other place where 1 and 1 equals 3. And our founders talked about higher emotional purposes, and that's what I thought you could extract, like distill from the past.
Well, you did, obviously, and I'm going to move a little bit faster than I intended because we have a lot of ground to cover. But from Civil War into baseball, and then jazz, and there are some other films, excellent films in between. Jack Johnson. There's a theme that's developing in your work, and I wonder, Walter, if we could play the clip that we have. This is a 13-minute clip assembled from some of Ken's work.
From 4 films, just brief clips.
Foreign
mostly.
films. Let's see it.
If we really want to know, the beginning should be the question, what is liberty?
Liberty is the most civilized and least of evils in this world.
Liberty is the absence of constraints and barriers and impediments.
It's freedom to be oneself, to do what one wants to do, to remain oneself for as long as one chooses to. And basically that's all. It's not happiness, it's not responsibility, it's not truth, it's just being oneself.
Well, liberty is the old French word that we have begun in English to equate with freedom.
What is liberty? That's quite a question. I suppose almost nobody really asks himself that question. Well, I can always quote the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident. The moment I be a people. And the moment I do that, I'm in trouble again.
expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic giant step the earth and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River or make a track on the Blue Ridge in the trial of 1,000 years. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide. Abraham Lincoln, 1837. In 1861, most of the nation's 31 million people lived peaceably on farms and in small towns. At Sharpsburg, Maryland, a German pacifist sect, the Dunkards, made their home in a sea of wheat and corn. In Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, population 2,400, young men studied Latin and mathematics at the small college there. Steamboats filled with cotton came and went at Vicksburg on the Mississippi. In Washington, D.C., Senator Jefferson Davis reviewed plans for remodeling the Capitol. In Richmond, the 900 employees of the Tredegar Iron Works turned out gun carriages and cannon for the U.S. government. At West Point on the Hudson, officers trained, and friendships were formed they thought would last a lifetime.
In thinking of America, I sometimes find myself admiring her bright blue sky, her grand old woods, her fertile fields, her beautiful rivers, her mighty lakes and star-crowned mountains. But my rapture is soon checked when I remember that all is cursed with the infernal spirit of slaveholding and wrong. When I remember that with the waters of her noblest rivers, the tears of my brethren are borne to the ocean, disregarded and forgotten. That her most fertile fields drink daily of the warm blood of my outraged sisters. I am filled with unutterable loathing. Frederick Douglass.
Jazz is the assassination, the murdering, the slaying of syncopation. I even go so far as to confess that we are musical anarchists. Nick LaRocca.
The original Dixieland Jazz Band now bills itself as the creators of jazz and undertook a tour of England. They were a sensation there too. But the band slowly fell apart. Eddie Edwards, the trombone player, was drafted into the Army in 1918. The pianist, Henry Ragas, died of influenza in 1919. Larry Shields, the clarinet player, quit in 1921, weary of the road. And in 1925, Nick LaRocca himself would suffer a nervous breakdown, abandon the road, and return to the construction business in New Orleans, as if he had never been a musician. But until the day he died, LaRocca would insist that his music and all jazz music had been an exclusively white creation. Black people, he said, had had nothing to do with it.
Many writers have attributed this rhythm that we introduced as something coming from the African jungles and crediting the Negro race with it. My contention is that the Negroes learned to play this rhythm and music from the whites. The Negro did not play any kind of music equal to white men at any time. Nick LaRocca. Well, Greece is you have to do for the kingdom to be well. And it's always something you don't want to do. And it's always that thing that's so much about you confronting yourself that is tailor-made for you to fail dealing with it. And the question of your heroism and of your courage and of your success at dealing with this trial is, can you confront it with honesty? And do you confront it, and do you have the energy to sustain an attack on it? And since jazz music is at the center of the American mythology, it necessarily deals with race. The more we run from it, the more we run into it. It's an age-old story. You know, if it's not race, it's something else. But in this particular instance, in this nation, it is race.
On December 11th, a Georgia congressman, Seaborn A. Roddenberry, introduced a constitutional amendment banning miscegenation, the intermarriage between Caucasians, and any and all persons of African descent, or having any trace of African blood. The amendment did not pass, but the poisonous debate went on for weeks.
Intermarriage between whites and blacks is repulsive and averse to every sentiment of pure American spirit. It is destructive of moral supremacy, and ultimately, this slavery of white women to black beasts will bring this nation a conflict as fatal and as bloody as ever reddened the soil of Virginia or crimson the mountain paths of Pennsylvania. Let us uproot and exterminate now this debasing, ultra-demoralizing, un-American, and inhuman leprosy.
In marrying Miss Cameron, Johnson has acted more honorably than many of the white gentlemen who are rearing octoroon families alongside their legitimate offspring. The St. Louis Argus.
There seems to have never been much of a fear of miscegenation if it was a white guy with a black woman. There didn't seem to be much fear about that. But the idea that the white woman might be attracted to a black guy was a different kind of phenomenon.
If you had your way, wouldn't you eliminate all the competition? So in that, I mean, in terms of race, get rid of all the black guys, keep all the women black and white, right? That would be the ideal. But that kind of thing was going on in people's minds. Competition.
It was a conflict within white Western culture as a whole. The great taboo of Thomas Jefferson, its miscegenation. The great lie of slavery is what was taking place on the plantations in the slave quarters. Jack Johnson brings this disease under the carpet in other ages and brings it to the surface. The white press loves it. Nothing is more designed to enrage a white American power structure as that. Jack Johnson, let's go after him. The black press is different. And even in this case, W.E.B. Du Bois defends Jack Johnson, saying, look, I disagree with Jack Johnson's choice of marrying a white woman, but he has that right. And we can't take that right away from him. And he hasn't done anything wrong.
Boxing has fallen into disfavor, into very great disfavor. The cause is clear. Jack Johnson. Neither he nor his race invented prize fighting or particularly like it. Why then this thrill of national disgust? Because Johnson is black. Of course, some pretend to object to Mr. Johnson's character, but we have yet to hear, in the case of white America, ball players, or even statesmen. It comes down, then, after all, to this unforgivable blackness. W.E.B. Du Bois.
This is kind of an obvious question.
If we
Oops.
really want to know her,
Stop.
Stop. We don't want to give away the ending yet.
Or go back to the beginning.
Or go back to the beginning. Thank you. Thank you. This is the overwhelming, continual theme in your work.
Well, it's not that I've gone looking for it. I mean, and I mean that sincerely. I am drawn to stories that are complex about American history. And, you know, of the 26, 27 films that I've made, I think there's only been 2 or 3 that haven't bumped into race. I don't think that you can scratch the surface of American history seriously without bumping into it in some way, as you know. And it's embedded there, you know, with James Baldwin's agony, you know, that it's not meant for him. Thomas Jefferson articulated what is our creed, the second sentence of the Declaration, and yet he owned 100 human beings as he wrote that, and he didn't see the contradiction, he didn't see the hypocrisy, and more important, didn't see fit in his lifetime to free any one of those human beings and set in motion an American narrative that is continually trying to deal with race. The Civil War would not have happened without it. The only art form that we as a people have created, that's recognized around the world, was created in a community that had the peculiar experience of being unfree in a free land. I mean, that's a kind of stop the presses, whiplash thing that gets you started. And so by being drawn to all of this stuff, you get pulled into story, and then inevitably, or more often than not, it comes down to race. This is the great sub-theme. And I wanted to comment, too, about just the glory of film. You know your reaction as you left Nick LaRocca's quote to Winton, kind of, he comes on and there's a black man, and you sort of laugh because here comes the answer, and then Winton struggles and he closes, and I have to tell you that I recorded that interview with Winton about 1.5 years before I'd heard of Nick LaRocca, 2 years before I recorded Harry Connick Jr. doing that, and had already placed that bite of Winton's in about 4 or 5 other places until I said, oh, he can answer Nick LaRocca in the editing room. And then all of a sudden, it was utterly organic for you. You understood that Winton had just heard that, this was the age-old forbearance and tolerance that African Americans have put up with. I mean, we put African American history in February, the coldest and shortest month, as if it is some politically correct addenda to our national narrative, when in fact it turns out to be the sort of almost bright, burning center of it.
So in making these films and in carrying this thing that you clearly feel so deeply, are you trying to persuade people? Is this an effort at grabbing the nation by the lapels and say, listen to me, this is the most important issue?
No, I think the most important issue is freedom. I think it's how we've parsed that, both individually, psychologically, spiritually, politically, socially, in all those ways. But the first thing you run up against as that is being explored, which is this American thing, is in our mythology, as Winton just said, is the centrality of race. And so, yeah, there is a bit about looking at it, and too often is that we cede the treatment of this to its own February, right? Let's look at black ball players. Let's look at the Negro Leagues. Let's only do this. And what I've insisted on in almost every instance is to integrate it, no pun intended, into the larger narrative. So as you know, particularly in baseball, the African-American narrative is integrated fully into the larger story of baseball. So it isn't just some other, correct way of equaling the scale. I've tried to say that it has been part of American life and has always been a part of American life. Randy Roberts, that was, by the way, Stanley Crouch, and then James Earl Jones, another Michigan alum, who were commented and unlabeled because they just appeared a few minutes earlier. But Randy Roberts, a biographer of Jack Johnson, is understanding that this is rooted in Thomas Jefferson, a subject of a film we've made. Lewis and Clark, you know, they take a woman and a black slave out there. As soon as they get out of the United States and they're wondering where to spend the winter, who gets a vote? Well, the woman gets a vote. She's not going to get a vote for another 120 years, right? Who gets a vote? The black slave, who's going to go back into slavery the second he comes back into the United States, but he gets to vote. York gets to vote. And so, you know, there's these constant resonances about what freedom actually means. And if Thomas Jefferson says all men are created equal, he meant all white men of property free of debt. But we don't mean that
It doesn't
now
sound as good, does it?
No.
Yeah. I hate to do this, but I'm going to skip past some of your greatest work, World War II, national parks, which is a real departure. I'm going to have to break my heart and skip past Prohibition, which is especially close to my heart, to get back to the Central Park Five. For those of you who don't know it, Ken's most recent film was his first full live-action film, or was that fair?
Well, it's still a documentary. It has no narration.
It has no narration and doesn't have much in the way of still. It has some still photography, but
it's filled with still photography, but it's filled with archival stories and the commentary. So what it lacks is, for a Ken Burns film, the sort of the omnipresent third-person narrator.
Right.
And what we've done is it's since its recent history, and we've not been unafraid of that. Our 10th inning brought us even more up to date than the Central Park Five. But our desire is to be so rigorously journalistic that we just put in title cards that would advance things with very few adjectives, and they usually refer to the rape victim, the rapee, Tricia Miley, as being brutally raped, or extraordinary recovery, which she had, just to sort of tell the story of this extraordinary injustice.
So what was this? Well, first of all, the experience was different because you did it with your daughter and your son-in-law.
With my oldest daughter and my son-in-law, David McMahon.
It was a family effort. By the way, it's being shown on Saturday, I believe.
It's going to be right here on noon on Saturday. It's been a lot of festivals and was released in November theatrically and played in 110 plus venues, and is going to be broadcast on April 16th on PBS.
So what was the particular challenge of this, which was a departure for you? What gave you pause, or what were you apprehensive about going into it?
You know, it wasn't apprehension. There was a kind of excitement. And I think I hid behind my daughter's and my son-in-law's sort of new sensibilities about how you could do this. But I had said to them, you know, let's not have any narration. It was sort of shoving off from familiar things, not because they were tired or old or that we're not doing them in other things we are, but it just seemed like an opportunity at experimentation. And there are parts of this film in which the editing pace is unlike any kind of editing pace you've seen in any other film. The music is contemporary and hip hop, so it has a different kind of resonance than most of the music we're used to in our 19th and 20th century topics, which is jazz or folk music that we've employed along with classical. So there's a lot of other things, and yet at the heart of it is this thing, you know. 5 African American and Hispanic children, 14, 15, and a developmentally challenged 16 years, were falsely accused and went to jail for upwards of 13 years for a rape they did not commit. It was front page news for weeks across the nation. It was front page news for months in New York City. It was the crime of the century, as Ed Koch said. And 13 years later, in an accidental bumping into of the actual rapist who is in jail for life, and one of the 5, he confessed, and his DNA was the only DNA that matched another human being to the crime scene. And you know, after their conviction, after they were out of jail, their convictions were vacated, and they're still struggling now for some sort of justice. And it just resonated with everything we've done. It was born out of a project my daughter had created. She had heard about this in Yale, too young to remember the actual event. I was editing the Civil War in New York when that took place, and she sort of like a dog, she got herself attached to it and finally wrote a book about it. And early on in her writing process, David McMahon, her husband, and I, he and I have collaborated for almost 15 years, he and I just sort of looked and went, wow, this is a good film too. And we'll also have one of the five, Raymond Santana, here on Saturday, we've gone out. I don't think we've been to a screening yet where we've done it alone, without their help and their understanding. And it feels different. And I feel like as I approach in a few months my 60th birthday, that I'm actually pushing in lots of different ways.
Well, does this lead you to we'll get it in a moment to what you're working on now, what you're coming up too, but does it make you, does it give you the inspiration to branch out stylistically? Or let me phrase this in a more unfriendly fashion.
Yeah.
Which is to say, your critics, who perhaps it was even before Civil War, but certainly since Civil War, they keep saying Ken Burns makes the same film, it's the same damn music, it's the same damn camera panning across, it's coming and it's going back, he's got famous actors talking, enough already. First, a reaction to that, and then a follow-up question.
I think it's really at the part, let me just, the kernel of truth in it is that there is a kind of seriousness or an earnestness that can be misunderstood. The fact is that we live in a society where the person assigned by whatever news organization to review an 18-and-a-half-hour film on baseball is the same person who has, in the same time, to review a half-hour situation comedy that's going to be canceled after 3 shows. And
she's not very good. I know who you're talking about.
There is a kind
We have one particular critic in mind here.
We actually, for much as we claim to be interested in story, because we are saturated in a media culture, we actually would rather have the Cliff Notes. We'd rather have the YouTube version. When people say, did you see The Daily Show last night? And they say, yeah. What they really mean is they probably watched the first quarter of it on YouTube, which was the opening Stewart monologue. And so I think that when you're asking somebody to do 18-and-a-half hours, we're not willingly submitting to narrative. And you have to be willing to submit to narrative. And it's very interesting that the Civil War, which you described as the sort of moment when we all stopped, that was about 40 million people. That was 1990. In 2007, 17 years later for the war, about the Second World War, we had 37 million people. In 1990, there were about 13 channels. In 2007, there were 500 channels, plus the internet, plus downloadable, all this sort of stuff. And what it meant to me is that it is possible, cynically, to see that. I mean, you could walk into a room of Cézanne paintings, not to make a comparison, and say, standing in the middle, all of these look alike. He's painting the same goddamn mountain, Mount Saint Victoire, over and over again, right?
Well, he did it. He did apples too. I mean, let's not
and he
forget
did some still lifes.
Some really nice apples.
But I think what it is that it takes coming up to the painting and understanding the struggles and the interpretations and things like what. And if you're not going to submit to narrative, then you do have the ability to stay on the outside and sort of take pot shots and see it all as similar. Because what I get from people who watch the films are, I can't believe the diversity of your subjects. And I go, really? I see myself as parochial and provincial because all I do is American history. But they see it as jazz music and baseball. That's a mile and a half away, and a war and this biography, and how do you keep them straight? When in fact, I have to acknowledge that I do make the same film over and over again, asking that question, who are we?
Well, let me take a step further.
So there.
Gosh, Ken, I'm your friend. I'm just trying to ask interesting questions. So, well, what have you learned anything from your critics? Are there things that critics have said that you think valid and that have made you a better filmmaker?
Well, I remember, and you can't really. It's sort of it's hard to answer it really honestly because you don't read a review and go, gee, they just eviscerated the jazz series, which is 17 hours long. But there's a lot of truth. My mother used to say that whatever the harshest criticism is, there always was something in it that was true. And I've always looked at that and read it and go, mm-hmm. But I don't think I've adjusted as much as I've just said, I don't want to change for the sake of changing. I want to change because it's organic. Embracing whatever stylistic elements that are different.
So you may see some validity in what the critics say?
Yeah, of course. I think there's always that. It's the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
It's exactly true. And particularly if you live in a culture that isn't willing to submit to 17 hours of anything, then this must seem like a Sisyphean task to approach it, particularly if there's that new situation comedy that might be much more easy to eviscerate and take less time to do.
Well, let's move to a critic who's more intimate with your work. What would you do over or do differently in the films that you've made? What do you look back on and say, I blew that one, or if only I had done this?
You know, the sort of the superficial one is nothing, because I sort of feel like it's like a scrapbook where you look back in that picture from the early 70s and you had that wide collar paisley shirt, with the tight long cuffs, and you go, yuck. And you'd never do, but you wouldn't rip that picture out. It was true. So they are, because of public television, I'm putting everything I can into it. At the same time, I can look at Brooklyn Bridge and understand that there were more measured fade-outs and not enough black, or that I heard in the tilt down the opening shot of the jazz clip that I could have tucked up, the difference between one sentence and another with Keith David. So I'm looking at all internal kind of pacing, structure issues.
What's your best film and what's your least great film?
I sort of feel, because of that public television sense, that we've never had to say, in the DVD extras, we never go, this is the director's cut. When PBS puts on our director's cut. So I, like my own children, I'd be a terrible dad if I said any one of my 4 daughters was my favorite. Obviously, the Civil War is kind of the one in the first line of the obituary, which, you'd like to kick off. And I actually think I
have rotisserie baseball in the first line of my rotisserie.
Yeah, well, I know.
And I'm not proud of that at all, so there we go.
I think I've made better films than the Civil War, and yet I don't know whether the moment the film, whether that could be repeated again. That we've almost equaled it several times. The baseball had many more viewers than the Civil War did the first time it was shown. Yeah. But if that's the way you measure it, let me cop out with Duke Ellington's Cop Out, which is the best of all. He is our greatest and most prolific composer. And someone asked him what is his most important composition. He said the one I'm working on now. Yeah. And since I am insane, I'm working on several.
Therefore, you gave me the segue to the next question. What are you working on now?
Well, it's funny that you asked that, Dan. We have just, the Central Park 5 will be, Ann Arbor fittingly is one of the last places where it'll be seen the way it should be seen in a theater, and then it'll be broadcast on PBS on April 16th. We've just finished, literally this week, finished a 7-part, 14-hour history of Theodore Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Before you go, there he goes, the same thing again. It's, believe it or not, no one's ever put them all together, seen it as a family drama. The subtitle is an intimate history, and while it is, and you get deeply into their psychologies, good, bad, and otherwise, it also covers all the larger events that are taking place that they are shaped by, and they in turn, more than any other family in American history, affected more human beings. As is my wont, in addition to the third-person narration expertly read by your friend and mine, Jeffrey Ward, who is himself a Roosevelt scholar and a polio victim, we have first-person voices, and Paul Giamatti does TR, and off camera, and this is memoirs and diaries and personal letters, and Franklin Roosevelt is read by Ed Herman, who's done him many, many times, from starting with Annie and then getting better. And then...
Hal Holbrook, who does Mark Twain Tonight, has been Mark Twain longer than Mark Twain was Mark Twain.
Exactly. Well, it took us longer to make the Civil War series than it did to fight it. Bada boom, brother against brother. And we were very fortunate to get a little-known actor named Meryl Streep to do Eleanor Roosevelt. And I have watched, we'd assembled, when you talk about the dauntingness of this, we'd assembled 1,350 years of postgraduate expertise in the Roosevelts or related administrations. And almost to a person, they would weep because they were hearing words they'd looked on. The thing, one of the other advantages of film, to bring alive stuff. And we've recent scholarship, which Jeff has pioneered, about intimate relationships that Franklin Roosevelt had with a distant cousin. the exchange of letters between them sort of reveals a side to him that we don't know.
You got a lot of other things cooking.
Okay, so and then that's 14. 15 is a biography of Jackie Robinson, which I'm working on with my son-in-law and my daughter Sarah Burns. We are just about to enter the editing room on probably our most difficult project ever, which is a 7 or 8 part history of the Vietnam War. And we have shot more than 100 interviews, more than we've ever done, a lot of it with North Vietnamese who are fighting our Americans. And sometimes we have the exact same moment that they're fighting across the line. And fortunately, we're at a particular moment in our relationship with Vietnam that of the 25, 30 interviews we've done, maybe 5 are doctrinaire who talk about the glorious people's struggle, and the others actually describe something very similar to what the majority of our interviews, 80% of them, the Americans, describe. And it's pretty terrifying and wonderful. And then we are writing and beginning to do the early filming of those that are old on a history of country music.
Mm-hmm. And then?
Well,
you've got Hemingway, right?
Well, and then and then we have
Hemingway.
We're haven't really started. I've been raising the money for a biography that we're now up to 2019, if you've been counting, a 2-part biography of Ernest Hemingway.
And what do you do on weekends?
I work on all of those films every weekend.
It's worth saying. I mean, a minute on your collaborators. One of the other things one encounters in working with Ken is you're working with an extraordinary team of people, and 3, Jeff, Dayton, and Lynn.
Well, there's been a writer who's been consistent through 2/3 of the film, and that's been Jeffrey Ward, who I mentioned. And there's sort of been 2 main producing tracks. Those are the films that I made with Dayton Duncan, who is a writer as well and a producer, and those I've made with Lynn Novick, who's only, for the most part, a producer. She has done some writing. And those with Lynn would be baseball and jazz and Frank Lloyd Wright and the war and Prohibition and the 10th inning, and we're Vietnam. And Dayton, we did the West and Lewis and Clark and Mark Twain and the national parks, Horatio's Drive, and most recently the Dust Bowl. And now we're working on country music. And then in a couple of instances, my longtime editor, Paul Barnes, we've done Jack Johnson, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and the Roosevelts. And then, to my great pleasure, my daughter Sarah and her husband Dave, this film in the Central Park Five, and then Jackie Robinson. So I am managing sort of 2 main and 2 smaller tributaries of productions that are all going at once. And, it's like cheaper by the dozen. I can hear the voice of each film and recognize it and give the attention as a director when I have to. And they sort of carry it to that moment where I walk in, sit down, and do an interview. Or
as they say, that, Ken this, Ken, he's off this, he's doing this, but when he walks into the editing room, he really does. Well, one more clip to show before we we'll have a couple comments after this clip, and then we'll go to questions, if that's all right. Yep. So, Walter, if you could run the next one.
This is a film that's not even been edited. We've just shot it, and I needed another project, like a hole in the head, but I could not do this project.
And I don't think it's been announced anywhere publicly.
Nowhere.
So you're the first to hear.
Nobody's ever seen this.
Yeah, so let's see it.
Okay, guys, let's please sit up straight in our chairs. Let's get ready to start morning meeting. Today, we are introducing the tradition here at Greenwood, studying and memorizing the Gettysburg Address. And in a lot of ways, it is a rite of passage.
This is one of the most famous speeches of all time. And this was like 200, 300 years ago. So even if you say it for like 2 minutes, it still means a lot. 4 score and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
It always amazes me the kind of courage that the boys have. It's very difficult when you're a kid to be different.
You know, I don't want people to get the wrong image that I'm disabled or I'm challenged or I'm handicapped. Because even though I know that's not the case for people that go to the school, if you have a learning disability, they're not going to say you have a learning disability. They're going to say you're dumb. You know.
They who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. Why can't he switch it around? Have so far nobly advanced. It makes. Yeah. That's why they have old English.
You can do this. I personally, as your therapist, I don't care whether you do it or not. What I care about is that you not do it because it's fearful for you.
Right. I just don't want to do it.
If I recite this address in front of people, it'll make me feel like I could actually do anything I want, and will eventually make me feel like a new man, I guess. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have concentrated it, far above our power to add or detract.
The world will let it know no longer remember what we said here, but it can never forget what they did here.
It is for us the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work for which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced.
It is rather for us to be here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us.
That from these our dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
From these, it is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion.
That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain.
That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
So tell us about this one.
My kids go to school in Putney, Vermont at a progressive little grammar school called the Grammar School. And down the road is the Greenwood School. And Putney also has, for a tiny town of just a couple thousand, a celebrated alternative prep school, and then another college for actually, coincidentally, learning disabled kids. But there are 55 kids at the Greenwood School. There are 33 faculty and staff. It's only boys, 11 to 15. And 10 years ago, I was asked to be a judge on that night, and it was much more funky and you know, in a gym, as it still is, but no tents and no lights. They've made it over the years. It's developed something, but it's been going since the school was founded about 50 years ago as a tradition there. And I watched these kids struggle. You know, out of the school, maybe 34 will do it. And you sit through a night where you're hearing the Gettysburg Address 34 times and seeing the various levels. Some kids would read it haltingly, but get some sort of meanings. Other kids would, you know, do it really quickly and loud. Others would need to be prompted, as you saw. It was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. And, you know, we tried to give as many medals away as you can. And just for the act of doing it. I mean, he says a new birth of freedom. You could just sort of see them sort of outrunning their deficits And I just said, boy, this is a film. And then a few years later, they invited me back, and I came, and I just said it should be a film. And I finally did it last year, and I said, you know, shut up, just do it. And what we found, we had no money. It's all been shot literally for nothing so far. We've got almost 200 hours. They are given the assignment around the time of the Gettysburg Address, which is in November 19th. And they recite it around the time of Lincoln's birthday, mid-February. And in between, we embedded 2 camera people who just volunteered their time and a sound person, somebody who's on my administrative staff, and they literally went every single day that school was
Presumably
open.
the parents had to all sign releases.
They've all signed a release.
The whole school.
The whole school signed a release. There are members of, as you saw, Abdullah, who's a member of the Saudi royal family, you know, very, very distant. They're kids from Singapore and Malaysia, and they're also kids from, you know, 7 towns away. It's extremely expensive, and they do an amazing thing. They say, you know, we know how to, every school knows how to treat dyslexia and these severe learning disabilities and ADHD that these kids have, but they also, we've always treated these kids as if the glass is half empty and we think you're half full. What do you do? And so they sort of feed a right brain. You know, are you good at sports? Are you good at music? Are you good at math? Are you good at you know, drawing? Are you good at wood shop? Are you good at, you know, whatever it is? And they feed that, and these kids develop a bond. There are fights, as you see. There's incredible backstories to almost everybody that we got to know in the course of these 3 months that we were embedded. So much so that, you know, in the middle of filming the final thing, I was convincing a kid that he had to do it. Not for my film, because I thought he should do it. We've come that close. And then when somebody else unexpectedly read it really, really well, I put down my camera and ran across the room and gave him a big hug. You know, I mean, we got that kind of close to it.
So when will we see it? How long will it be?
Well, it'll probably be like the Central Park 5, a feature-length thing, meaning 2 hours or less. And it just, God willing, that we get some funding and we can, because we actually have to pay an editor now who's starting work on it. And to sort through it, and hopefully we could get it done in time for the 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, which is this November 19th.
Great.
And hopefully be out on PBS a year or so from now.
Great. Now, speaking of getting done in time, we've got 15 minutes left, and I think it's time to go to audience questions. There are microphones in each aisle at the head of it.
Don't be shy.
Could we bring up the house lights a bit? Yeah, thank you very much. Who got here first?
So many of you.
Please, sir.
Mr. Burns, thank you for your support of the festival all these years. I was curious as to what films or filmmakers really stick in your memory from when you went to the festival.
I remember George Manupelli, most of all. I still possess an old, not reprinted, but an old vintage Dr. Chicago t-shirt. I remember that at the end of the 60s, seeing George Manupelli walking across the campus, striding through town, was, I thought, as great as if we'd caught a glimpse of Francois Truffaut. And I remember seeing a lot of experimental things. Obviously, Bruce Conner, really stands out, but also Stan Brakhage and Maya Deren, a lot of stuff I cut my teeth, whether it was in the festival or at Cinema Guild. For a kid, it's sort of hard to distinguish where I saw it. And I saw my first breaths on a film at the Ann Arbor Film Festival. I think my father was like, what have I gotten my son into? And it was a hugely seminal thing, and in fact, I endow a prize for the best in festival every year because I just think what happens here, when we think of movies, when the world thinks of movies, they think of Hollywood, and Hollywood represents such a narrow band in the spectrum of things, and there's so much other filmic expression that takes place that this festival has for 51 years just said, no, it's this way too, and it's great to see that.
I'm sorry.
I remember seeing Brooklyn Bridge. Did you enter it at the festival? I thought I saw it there.
Maybe
it was just in location.
I think the Brooklyn Bridge has shown, and I think Huey Long has shown.
Okay.
Thank you.
On the right, please.
All right, Mr. Burns, my mother and I are both really big fans of your films.
And she's just too scared to come up and ask a question, right?
And I had a question for you. I really enjoyed your National Parks, the America's Best Idea film. I mean, I thought it was fantastic. I mean, just beautiful. I had a question. Personally, what do you want the future of the National Park Service to look like?
That's a great question. I'd like to see more parks. You know, the whole time we were working on it, the 10 years that we were working on it, there were 58 natural national parks out of a Park Service system that has, you know, something like 400 units, but they're historical sites and battlefields and, you know, monuments. And just a couple weeks ago, we elevated Pinnacles, which is just east of Monterey, California, from a national monument status to a national park. It's the first one that's been done in more than a decade. So there's a lot of work in protecting. A monument has some degree of protection, but nothing like the kind of congressional approval given to a national park, which means it's ours forever and they can't mess with it. And so I think our task is twofold. One is obviously to expand this extraordinary rich heritage, but the other one is also to protect and do the kind of restoration necessary. In the Bush administration, 8 years of neglect of the national parks, there was something like over $8 billion in unspent money that was already appropriated for restoration of the parks that just wasn't spent. And that means roads and visitor centers and bathrooms and trails, some of which date back to the 19th century or to the New Deal and that. So we have a lot of work to do.
So I'm going to whisper this so nobody else hears it, Ken.
We
only have 11 minutes left and we have 22 people in line.
Oh, great.
So we're going to move to the lightning round.
Okay.
Fast questions, fast answers.
Thank you.
Okay, mine's really not a fast question, but I'll ask it anyway. I noticed most of your films are about men in history, and which is really wonderful and it's fabulous. This next question is going to sound super feminist, and I'm not a feminist, but I heard something today in class that was really disconcerting to me as a woman because I'm interested in going into film as well. And it's that most films today are not, they do not have female influence in them. They don't feature women, they don't view women in a light that shows female empowerment in any way. And I was just curious, as a male director, where do you see the future of film going? Do you see women being involved more in, I mean, even
well,
with
I get your question,
Yeah,
and it
please.
really depends on what medium you're talking. If it's Hollywood, if they make money, then they'll get another film project. That's it. Other places, women, you know, I won't say dominate, but are hugely important. And in my life, as the father of 4 daughters, and I hope you would be a feminist, I think it's a hugely important thing to be. There's nothing wrong in claiming that mantle, but the Brooklyn Bridge film, the first one, was completed by a heretofore Victorian housewife who took over the construction when her husband was the Shakers. My second film was about a celibate sect in which women had equal roles and equal rights for the first time in American history. They were also pacifists. We have sections in almost every film. We did a film called Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, Not for Ourselves Alone, about the women's movement, which won a Peabody Award. I can't go home and show my face unless we're representing it, and I think you'll find one of the most extraordinarily interesting figures in all of American history is Eleanor Roosevelt when you see this. So I'm with you 100%. The problem is definitely out there, and what you describe requires you, unfortunately, like African Americans, to just go the extra mile in a world that has been, in almost every respect, dominated completely by men, which means you have to sort of prove yourself and prove yourself again before you've even reached the same level of the sort of the journeyman hack guys around. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
That was 30 seconds.
No, it wasn't.
There are times when I thought that you and David McCullough had this conversation going on back and forth. I know he's in some of your films, but one of the more interesting books David McCullough once wrote was called Brave Companions, and I don't know if you've read it. One of the interesting departures was, rather than on a particular historic era topic, he picks people out of history, American history, and strings them together as brave companions on a journey, though they're hundreds of years, a couple hundred years apart in some cases. And I wondered if you'd ever thought about that kind of structure.
You know what, I haven't. I've been so wedded to narrative. It's really important to tell a story. Even if it's a big thing like the Civil War, baseball, or jazz, its constituent building blocks are individual biographies and people that, you know, not just, but they're the skeletal structure. And that when you sort of break apart and do different kinds of things, you end up a little bit more essayistic and expository than I like to be. A good story is just and then and then and then. And you should arrive at Ford's Theater in the Civil War thinking that it might not turn out the way you know it does. And that's the great thing about history. If history works well, you go there going, oh, please let the gun jam this time. I'm serious about that, and that's what you want. Brave Companions is a wonderful book, but so far we're not going to string beads along a necklace in exactly that fashion.
Thanks, Ken. Blake said, "We become what we behold." 100 years of cinema, 100 years of guns in experimental films, docs, and Hollywood. Stanley Kubrick banned his film Clockwork Orange for 30 years, fearful of copycat murders. What can we do about violence in cinema?
I think that violence in cinema right now is the least of our worries with regard to the gun problem that you talk about. I am for gun control. I don't think you need big magazines. I don't think you need assault weapons. I think you need some form of registration so that we know who has guns. And, it seems like a no-brainer. We have driver's license. We tell people how old they have to be when they can vote and how old they can be when they can drive. And I think that we're missing a huge part of the Second Amendment, which says a well-regulated militia. And we've allowed this to metastasize and to basically have all of the most regressive aspects of our national political conversation devolve to the ownership of a gun, which is a really bad combination. You know what I mean? That the anger and the hatred and the assumption that white men are suddenly this endangered species, is just like one of the great fallacies of the world. And this is the fact that it's now prompting a rise in contributions to the NRA and rise in gun, of people purchasing guns is just, foolhardy. Cinema's the last place, that we need to start regulating it.
On the right.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken, for being here, and thanks for your phrase, submit to the narrative.
Yeah.
That's a really important message.
We're too lazy right now. It's really true.
Yeah, and my question is, do you have any advice for young filmmakers, budding filmmakers, teenagers, high school students who might not have the attention span, maybe not reading novels?
They do have the attention span. Just think all of those kids, those teenagers that are now taking film, when they were preteens, they were coming at midnight to Borders to buy a Harry Potter's book that takes them longer to read than any one of my films. We all meaning accrues in duration. The work you're proudest of, the relationships you care most about have benefited from sustained attention. And while we can enjoy things that come that quickly, that's the way Sesame Street is built, right? On a 2-minute kind of YouTube vibe, and that's been going for 30 or 40 years. It is those larger things, the things that we have our sustained attention, where I believe all meaning accrues. And everyone has that capacity, regardless of what age they've come into, whatever distractions there are there. I was told that no one would watch the Civil War for 2 reasons. One, Stephen Bochco had introduced this new singing musical called Cop Rocks, and that this was the MTV generation with quick cuts, and no one would ever look at still photographs that had a kind of leisurely pace, to not quote the critics directly. But they did. And now it's because we live in this YouTube, we may not have an attention span. It's true, attention has been eroded. We are multitasking, we are missing some things, but we know we're missing them. And the things that provide us with the joy in our lives are the things in which occur in duration.
And they can do it.
And anybody can do it.
Go ahead.
Okay. I've always wanted to be a filmmaker since I was a little kid, and me and some friends have started to make a movie. And I'm really into history. I'm in AP US History. I'm in a class called America Since 1960, and we just got done with the subject of the decade of the 60s, talking about counterculture, civil rights, anti-war, and...
Guilty.
And I was just wondering, out of all of those, which would be like a good subject to do?
Well, I'm doing the war in Vietnam, which will take into all of that, and we've done civil rights and things like that. They're all good, but the more important question is, for somebody starting off, you've got two basic things. One sort of Socratic, who am I? Do I really have something to say? Do I really want to do this? Am I drawn to film because everybody else is drawn to film, or because it seems glamorous and I didn't realize how hard of work it is? But if you can answer that question in the affirmative, then the second thing comes in, that are you willing to persevere? As Winton says, are you willing to confront it and sustain an attack on it? Because there are lots of really talented people, as I'm sure you are, who may just give up because they reach some obstacles. So my questions to you sound like horrible platitudes. You'll choose your own topic from your gut, but you will decide it. I won't. Yeah. You'll choose that subject, and you'll know that that's the thing you want to do because you've tested it against your true self, and you'll realize that if you have succeeded in completing a film, it's because you've overcome mountains of resistance. And that will be very happy. And everybody here wants you to succeed.
Yeah, I'm afraid we have time. We might have time for one more question and answer, but please.
So my question's kind of similar. It's actually, how do you pick your topics? Is it kind of like the moment myth? And have you ever thought like, oh, the Civil War is way too big, let me just pick one battle?
Well, you know, that was what my father thought I should do. You know, I think they pick me. And I say that, you know, loosely because, of course, we choose them. And we, meaning all the people that Dan and I have discussed. But I make a final decision, and it has to do with all the ideas, you know, the ping pong balls bouncing around like the lottery, and then all of a sudden a few come down into your heart, and you say, I have to do this. It's just how you can be in a class in college or high school, and there might be 500 people in your class, and you know everybody by face, you know 250 names, and you're acquainted with 75, and 25 are friends, and 5 you'll know for the rest of your life. How did that happen? I don't know, chemistry, accident, coincidence, the same class, you know, something we have yet to determine. But we choose topics. If I were given 1,000 years to live, I would not run out of topics in American history. And the idea that I've got all of these going on and are trying to juggle them is just ferociously difficult, but also so exciting and liberating that I can't wait to add whatever the next one will be.
And if we had another 3 hours, we could keep this going, but I'm afraid there's another group coming in at 7:15. Ken, thanks.
Thank you.
And thank all of you.